Shiurim measurements are a fundamental part of the life of a Yid. They impact our daily lives. Bracha Achroina, what we make after we eat something, Birchas Hamazon, are all dependent on Shiurim, on measurements. Every Shabbos, when we make Kiddush, we have to have a kais, a cup that holds a revius. More Shiurim relate to the Yom Tovim. Yom Kippur has Shiurim that relate to a chayla, someone who's ill. Sukkos, there are measurements that relate to the walls of the sukkah, to the schach. Chanukah, exactly how high the menorah is. Shiurim certainly are part and parcel of Hilchos Pesach. We have various mitzvahs at the HaSeder in particular that have to be performed based on the size of what's eaten and how much we drink, as well as the amount of time we take to eat and drink these items. Let us first discuss some of the background that relate to Shiurim in general, and then focus on the Halacha LMaaseh that relates to Pesach in particular. Just a few notes. We'll discuss various opinions. There's no way to discuss all of the opinions. And also, as with all halacha, one should consult with your Rav. We're only going to highlight some of the Halacha LMaaseh, but one should consult with his Rav when one has a question. Just to note the chshivas of numbers and the importance of precise shiurim and doing it right. I like to give a mashal of a person wakes up 8 o'clock in the morning, they're on the East Coast, and they want to call their friend in New York, and instead of dialing 212 for the area code, which is New York, they dial 213. What's the big deal? 2, 3, what's the difference? Instead of calling someone at 8 a.m. in New York, they wake someone up at 5 a.m. in Los Angeles. It's the same thing with shiurim. Sometimes if you're off, even by a little bit, it can be the difference between being yaitse and not being yaitse. When we address this topic, it's well known that shiurim are both volume and time. And there's also a difference in measurements between solids and liquids. As we will see, liquid measurements, we'll speak later in the shiur, liquid measurements have a whole different calculation. So the most famous shiur is a kazayas. A kazayas is the size of an olive. Many isurim, many prohibitions relate, a person's chayiv, so to speak, when they eat a kazayas. And so too, at the HaSeder, the minimum shiur of Matza is a kazayas. We'll see exactly, well, let's see, Matza's 2 kazayas, but the base shiur is a kazayas. Maror, how big is a kazayas? The answer is not so simple. Of course, kazayas literally means the size of an olive. The Kosos in Eruvin Daf Pebed Bey says a kazayas is a half of an egg. The Rambam says it's a third of an egg. But how big is an egg? This too is a machlokes achronim. The Chazon Ish, according to Tosfos, says it's an egg with its shell. The Mishabur in Siman Tov Pei Vav says a kazayas is half an egg with its shell. The achronim further discuss the volume of the shell. But one of the most famous discussions regarding the shiur of a kazayas relates to the tests conducted by the Noda B'Yehuda in Prague over 200 years ago. As recorded on today's daf in his Sefer Tzlach HaMaseches Pesachim, Daf Kuf Tazayin, where the Tzlach went ahead and he says, here's a question, because perhaps we say Niskatnu Shiurim. What is Niskatnu Shiurim? Shiurim have gotten smaller. To understand this Tzlach and the nafkaminas in Hilchos Pesach, we first have to give a brief introduction into volume measurements. Let's, as a mashal, talk about just standard scientific measurements that just relate to things that we measure. Let's start with the metric system. 1 milliliter is a volume measurement. It's equal, and 1,000 milliliters would fill a 1 liter bottle of seltzer. About 30 milliliters of schnapps in a schnapps cup, in a plastic schnapps cup, is 1 ounce. So 1 milliliter is also known as 1 cc, 1 cubic centimeter. What is a cubic centimeter, and what does length have to do with volume? The answer is cubic centimeter means it's a very small box, small container, that's 1 centimeter long, 1 centimeter wide, and 1 centimeter high. And there's a direct correlation between length to volume. A plastic box that's 20 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 10 centimeters would be 1,000 cubic centimeters and would hold 1,000 milliliters, which is 1 liter. In English, it's a little more cumbersome. 1 gallon is 231 cubic inches. So that means if you have a box, a container, that's 11 inches by 7 inches by 3 inches tall, that would equal a gallon. Chazal understood this. But let's illustrate what we mean. Let's take a little toy that's hollow in the middle. How much water would fit in here? So it has a volume measurement. If we look at the top, it's 2.8 centimeters by 2.8 centimeters. That's the length and the width. And if we look at the depth, if we measure the depth, it comes out to about 3.1 centimeters. That means that this item is 2.8. If we do 2.8 times 2.8 times 3.1, we'll get 24.3 cubic centimeters, which means it should be able to hold about 24, 25 milliliters, because we said 1 cubic centimeter is equal to a milliliter. So 25 cubic centimeters, which this is, because we measured 2.8 times 2.8 times 3.1, and we got 25. This should hold 25 milliliters. Let's see if that's accurate. We take water, and we fill up this. And now we filled it up to the top. And now we have to measure this. And we measure it, and it comes out about 25 milliliters. Because 25 milliliters is equal to a cube, which is 25 cubic centimeters. And the way you could add it, you could get to that any way you like. It could be 2.5 times 2 is 5 times 5 centimeters. Any way you get 25, it's approximately 25 cubic centimeters is 25 milliliters. So Chazal understood this. And in fact, the Gemara in Pesachim, Daf Kuftes, tells us that a liquid measurement known as a revius is 2 etzbos by 2 etzbos by 2.7 etzbos. An etzba is a finger, but it's the width of the average person's thumb measured at the joint. Chazal are telling us that 2 etzbos by 2 etzbos by 2.7 etzbos, which is going to be a 10.8 cubic etzbos, is equal to a revius. The length times length times length, which gives you a cubic measurement, is equal to a volume. The Gemara further says that a mikveh is an amma al amma b'raim gimel amas, which means a mikveh is 3 ammas by 1 amma by 1 amma, and that's equal to a mikveh, which is 40 saw, another measurement. We're not going to deal with that measurement, though it's a large measurement, but it's just giving the understanding that Chazal utilized the length times length times length to give a volume measurement. So the tzlach went ahead and measured this. The tzlach measured the thumb, 2 by 2 by 2.7, and he said, okay, I now have a certain container size, and that container should be a revius. So that would be equal to a revius. Now, based on that, we know that a kabeya is equal to 2/3 of a revius, and based now on our revius, based on the thumb, and now we transfer it to the egg, we come out the egg is going to be 120 cubic centimeters, or 4.1 fluid ounces. That's what the etzbos transferred to eggs is going to give us an egg of about 4 fluid ounces. But then the tzlach went ahead, the Native Yehuda went ahead and measured an actual egg. And he came out that an egg is only about 58 cubic centimeters, which is 2 fluid ounces. So something didn't make sense. The Gemara says that this length of my thumb, if I do it cubic, I'm going to get the size of an egg, which is give me a revius. But then when I go ahead and I measure the actual egg that we have to get my revius, I come up with a different shiur. So the Native Yehuda said, must be niskatnu shiurim, that our eggs are smaller than they were. And so too is our kazayas, because a kazayas is a half an egg. And that was the conclusion of Native Yehuda. So the Rebbe said eggs today are half the size that they used to be. So when Chazal said a kabeya, the size of an egg, they mean 2 of our eggs. And when Chazal said a kazayas, it doesn't literally mean the kazayas of our size, because based on the connection with the fingers, with that bows, it comes out that a kazasim of yesteryear, that measurement is going to give a kazayas that's much bigger. That's twice the size of our olives. And therefore the kazayas per se is really equivalent to 2 of our olives, to 2 kazasim. Now, not everyone agreed with the Night of Yehuda. His Talmud, the Shas Tshuva Be'ava, Rav Chaim Noah, and others disagreed. So with all of the above, we can understand why there are an array of shitas as to what the volume of a kazayas is, what a revius is, and so on. It becomes a question exactly, do we say it in this Niskat Neshurim, or don't we say in this Niskat Neshurim? The Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Pesach and Siman Tov Pei Vav is mechalik between the Eraises and the Rabbanans. And says when it comes to the Rabbanan, let's say a bracha achroina, so then you don't say Niskat Neshurim. You would take a kazayas is equal to half an egg, half of our egg. And therefore, you would take that measurement. However, for a Dairaisa, for a Torah Chiyav, a Torah Mitzvah, like a kazayas of Matza, now we have to assume Niskat Neshurim, and we have to take the size of 2 olives, of our olives, which means the size of a full egg of nowadays, and that is the kazayas of yesteryear. So practically speaking, that means the shear of a bracha achroina will be around 1 fluid ounce, because our eggs are about 2 ounces, approximately, and this is also a question, which egg do you take? But roughly we'll say that an egg is roughly 2 ounces, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, and therefore a kazayas will be about a fluid ounce, although some maybe a little less, 27 cubic centimeters. A fluid ounce is equal to 29.5 cubic centimeters. So let's say 30 cubic centimeters. So some opinions will say a kazayas is a little bit less than an ounce, which means about 27 cubic centimeters. Others will say it's more like 33 cubic centimeters. Some even go as high as 38 cubic centimeters, which interestingly enough is the size of a golf ball. A golf ball is 40 cubic centimeters. Roughly speaking, if you eat something the size of a golf ball, it's a uniform measurement, you'll definitely be eating a kazayas d'Rabbanan. In other words, you'll be eating a kazayas to make a bracha achroina. Again, you really need a little bit less than this, either a drop less or those that hold 33. Again, it's about 40 cubic centimeters. If you hold 38 or 33, it'll be less than this. If you hold 27, it'll certainly be much less than this. We'll revisit this year a little bit later, when we get to Maror and so on, which is only d'Rabbanan. For D'Oraisa, we say Niskat Neshurim. So we're going with the Etzbos numbers, which we convert into volume. Using the Cheshbainis of Etzbos, Reb David Feinstein, Zichron Tzaddik Livracha, in his Haggadah called Doidi, says that the kabeya that's used is 3 ounces. So half of that would be 1.5 fluid ounces, which is 44 cubic centimeters. Some go as high as 1.69 fluid ounces, which is 50 cubic centimeters. Some go as high as 1.69 fluid ounces, which is 50 cubic centimeters. But it's clear that the second kazayas, Maitzi Matza, we eat 2 kazasim. And therefore, you don't need 2 kazasim d'Oraisa. The first kazayas is d'Oraisa, and the second is d'Rabbanan. So technically, if you ate 2 kazasim, which is d'Rabbanan, and you ate the kazayas min HaTorah, then you're covering all bases. You're getting in 2 kazayas d'Rabbanan, which is going to be the 1 kazayas d'Oraisa. So practically speaking, how big is this? Here, machine matzahs, you'll start at the HaSeder with 3 machine matzahs. For Matzi Matzah, how much do you eat? So the higher shitas, here are 3 matzahs, you have it your HaSeder. The higher shitas, Reb David Braunfeld in his Sefer on Shiurei, Maznei Tzedek says that you need a full matzah to be a kazayas, a whole matzah. Again, we're only giving approximations here. Some matzahs, even machine matzahs, will be a little bigger, a little smaller. We just took a sample matzah. Reb Pinchas Badner, in his Sefer, says that you need 2/3 of a matzah for Maitzi Matzah. So if you look at the matzah, you would want to break it into break off a piece, and that would be, you'd have 2/3 of the matzah. If we measure this out with a ruler, This matzah is 16 centimeters across the top. So if you wanted it to be 2/3, let's say, roughly you would be a little bit more than, you'd cut it at the 10 centimeter mark, which is approximately right here, 10.5 centimeter mark, let's say at 11 or so. So you would cut it over here, and your 2/3 of a matzah would be roughly this matzah. A little bit less than this, but that would be about 2/3 of the matzah. Rav Moshe Heinemann Shlita says a half a matzah is enough. So a half a matzah, you break it in half. Let's say it's a drop more than a half, not precise, but you would have a half a matzah. That will be enough for your d'oraisa to kashir for achilas matzah. So again, it's roughly somewhere between a half a machine matzah and a whole machine matzah. Again, depending on the size, and it really depends. You want to be machmir, you can eat more. Some people have a difficult time eating matzah. Those b'shas adchak, those who are ill, could certainly go less, could take the lower end and even go less than a half a matzah if necessary. Less than a half of a machine matzah in order to be yaitz in the mitzvah of achilas matzah. Now, hand matzahs are much more complicated because ultimately it depends on how big the matzah is and how thick they are. Last year, Rav Heinemann Shlita conducted testing of volume of tzel and pupa matzahs, where there were about 10 matzahs per pound, waterproofed the matzahs, and did a water displacement procedure. The way to test matzahs, if you just stick matzahs into water, they would get soaked with the water, so you don't get an accurate shear. The true way to determine the measurement, the volume measurement, is water displacement. So you fill up a container, and then you waterproof the matzahs, and you stick it in, you fill it to the tippy top of water, you stick the matzahs in, obviously you're not going to eat those matzahs, they're for test only, and you stick them in, and now you see how much water came out. There were also, Rav Heinemann reviewed the results of 3D scanning, and the results came out that a half a hand matzah is enough lechatchila. Again, we're going with a tzel and pupa matzah. Other matzahs you may need a little more if they're smaller, or technically a little less if they're larger or thicker. Someone who's ill, that has celiac, for example, or diabetic, that can't eat so much. So a quarter of a hand matzah, again, on the average, maybe you might need a little more, a little less, but certainly a quarter matzah, one who is ill would be yaitze. Reb David Feinstein, Zohar Tzaddik Livracha, says on the first night of Pesach, one should eat 2/3 of an average hand matzah. Rabbi Bonner, in his sefer on kazayas, if the matzahs are thin, you have 9 matzahs per pound, so then you need slightly more than a half a matzah. If they're thick, you have, let's say, 6 matzahs in a pound, very thick matzahs, so then slightly more than a third would be enough. That's extremely thick. But again, a thin matzah with a 9 per pound, slightly more than a half, would be enough. If it's in between, very thick and thin, let's say you have 7.5 matzahs per pound, then it would be somewhere between a third and a half a matzah. Where Braunfeld in his Mazda said it comes out with similar shiurim, but slightly higher. 10. If there's 10 in a box, then you want 2/3 of a matzah. And again, very, very similar to that of Rabbi Banner shiurim. Rabbi Braunfeld in his sefer makes an important point, that spelt matzahs are the same density as wheat matzahs, and therefore it would be similar shiurim to the matzahs of wheat. Oat matzahs are much more dense than wheat, and therefore the amount eaten to reach a kazayas will weigh more because they're denser. In other words, halacha goes by volume, and therefore if you go by volume, then if you have an oat matzah, you still need the same volume, even though you're getting more weight because it's more dense. You're packing in more. If we want to describe dense, rocks are more dense than feathers because you get a lot more weight. The density is much higher. It's much denser. It's condensed. And therefore, so too, oat is more condensed. You'll actually get a much heavier matzah per se, which leads to an important brief discussion, and that is, could you measure matzahs by weight? Again, the Iker halacha goes by volume. The kazayas is a volume measurement. You could measure by weight, provided that you know the density of the product, of the matzah, and you've made the proper conversions for that density. And then if you know the density, Sfardim work these types of measurements, But even Ashkenazim technically could, but you have to measure the density and then know exactly if I have this product and it's this dense, now this weight is equal to this volume, and therefore for Maitzi Matzah I need this, for Afikaiban I need this, etc., because the weight is a direct correlation to the volume. But you can't just take weight just arbitrarily, because weight is dependent on exactly how dense it is. If you're using one type of item and then measuring the weight of a different item, you're going to get a wrong read, because the weight is based on density, and if it's different densities, then you're going to need different weights in order to determine what shear is necessary. So how do you do matzah? Here's how the shiurim are going to work by Maitzi Matzah, because typically there are other people at the HaSeder, and now how do you give out the matzah exactly and have the shiurim? Because obviously from the 1 matzah or 1.5 matzahs that you have for Maitzi Matzah, there's not enough for everybody, because everyone has to eat 2 kazesim. There's not enough to go around. So how is it done? So you hold up the matzahs, and again, we don't have the cover and so on, but we're just illustrating. You're going to make the bracha first holding the 2.5 matzahs. Again, yachatz has already happened, so we have a smaller half of a matzah in the middle. And now you're first going to make the bracha of Hamaitzi Lechem Min Haaretz on the 2.5 matzahs, because that's your Lechem Mishnah. So you've made on 2 shleimas with the half in the middle. Then you put down the bottom matzah, and that's going to be used for kairech. Now you have 1.5 matzahs in your hand, and you make the bracha of al achilas matzah. When you finish the bracha al achilas matzah, and you might see everybody, you have das to be might see everybody, and they have das to be yaitza. Now, how do you give this out? So if you have a lot of people at the table, what you're going to do is you have to, each person is going to get a little bit of each of these matzahs, and then you're going to give them a shear. So let's say you break this down for everyone to get a piece. You break this down into smaller pieces, and we're just doing an example here. Okay, so now that was my top matzah, and now I want to make sure everyone gets from the bottom, from the middle matzah as well. So now you have this as well, and you're giving everybody that as well, and now everybody has a little bit of that. Okay, now everybody has a little piece. Now obviously you can't just give this out. Right here was the top one. You give this out. You can't just give this out. There's not enough to be yaitza. Okay, so let's say someone wants to be yaitza with a half. So you hand this off to them, and now you have half a matzah, maybe a little bit more, and everyone's ready to eat. Of course, there's no talking. You're gonna ideally start with the lechem mishnah matzah, and you'll eat both of them, and bite into them and swallow it, and then your shear that you're eating in order to eat a kazayis. Let's say someone wants 2/3 of a matzah. They want to go with that measurement. So again, you give them a little bit, and the 2/3, and now you hand this to the person, and now they have from the lechem mishnah, they have the shear, and they're going to eat this achilas matzah immediately. And again, we'll get to the zman and the time in a moment. As we mentioned, time is also a factor. The kazayis has to be eaten in a time known as kedei achilas pras. What does that mean? Rashi in Yuma Daf Pamid Beis says achilas chatzi kikar, a half of a loaf of bread. A kikar shalem, a full loaf of bread, is mazen beis sudas, is equal to 2 meals, or bread that you would eat for 2 meals. So a chatzi kikar, a half a loaf, is equal to a suda achas. And that's what achilas pras is. The suda achas, the chatzi kikar. How much is that? Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Yom Kippur, some Tafrei Shud Beis, Sif Daled, brings 2 days. Yesh Imrim, Daled Beim, some say it's equal to 4 eggs. V'yesh Imrim, Gimel Beim, some say it's equal to the size of 3 eggs. Practically speaking, the stipler in Sefer Shiur and Shel Torah, based on the Chassam Sofer, on Amud Samach Zayin, says ideally it should be eaten within 2 minutes. Mitchilas hakazayis ad soifai. So that means that you got the matzah, as we just showed, now you want to eat it, ideally, from the moment you swallow your first bite until you finish, whatever the shear is, should be done in a span of 2 minutes. Reb Moshe Feinstein on Tzaddik Livracha, and Igros Moshe Archaim, Chelik Dalet Siman Mem Aleph, based on the Maseches, says one should finish within a span of 3 minutes. And the Shiur and Shel Torah from the stipler, as well, in the second day, as well as Shiurei Torah for HaRav Chaim Na, says that you have 4 minutes to finish the kazayas, which means, basically we'll say, it's ideal to do it in 2 minutes, but you really have 4 minutes. So when we ate this 2/3 of a matzah, or half of a matzah, whatever we eaten, together with the hamaitzi, again, we just picked a sample. These matzahs may be a little bit thicker samples, that's what we were able to get. at this point. But when you eat whatever shear you're eating, you want to do it certainly within 4 minutes, and you want to eat it straight. So you can't nibble and stop and start. You want to eat it within a 4-minute span of time. Certainly that half a matzah, you want to be able to eat within a 4-minute span. If it's too difficult, the person can't eat that fast. One should ask a shayla exactly how much they need to eat and within what time span they're able to have kedei achilas pras. Agav, in order to make a bracha achroina on food all year round, one needs to eat a kazayis b'kedei achilas pras. So to make, if you eat bread, you eat challah at the Shabbos table, you can't just nibble a little bit. Shabbos, ideally, you're supposed to eat a kabeh v'yaiser, which means a little more than 2 kazaysim. But a kazayis is enough. So certainly the first kazayis has to be eaten in his man kedei achilas pras. Doesn't mean it has to be right away, but l'mashal, somebody could take a nibble and then sit down and then take a balabasta, may make her hamaitzi, then go to the kitchen, then come back, eat a little more, then leave or take a break or talk, and then over a span of time, you had a kazayis, but it wasn't kedei achilas pras. It has to fit in. One kazayis must be eaten within a 4-minute span. The second kazayis v'yaiser could be eaten over an extended period of time. Also, as a side note, to make a bracha in the Tilas Yadayim, whenever you eat bread, you make the bracha of Al Tilas Yadayim. To make a bracha Al Tilas Yadayim, one needs to eat a kabeya of pas. If you're only eating a kazayis, you would make hamaitzi and bench, but you would not make a bracha Al Tilas Yadayim. You would have someone else that would be mitzi you, or you would just not make the bracha. Let's talk about the other parts of the Seder. For kairech, where we sandwich the matzah and the maror, so here it's only d'Rabbanan. So there, 1/4 of a hand matzah of tzelem pupa would be enough. Rabbi Bonner in his sefer says that if it's a thin matzah, it would be slightly less than 1/3 of a matzah. That's enough for kairech. And if it's a thick matzah, obviously it would be less than that. We'll get to the shiur of Maror for kairech in a moment. And of course, by machine matzahs, it would also be lower than it was the shiurim that we gave for machine matzahs. It would be lower for kairech because again, kairech is only midrabanan. What about dafikaimen? Dafikaimen that's eaten, of course, at the end of the Suda, at the end of Shulchan Aruch. One eats 2 kazaysim also, ideally. One is for the Karban Pesach, and the second is for the matzah that was eaten together with the Karban Pesach. So you eat matzah for the matzah eaten with the Karban Pesach, and you're eating another kazayis, which is a zeicher to the Karban Pesach itself. And it was Afikam was eaten ala soiva, Karban Pesach was eaten full ala soiva, so we eat it at the end of the meal. If it's too difficult, then one could be yaitze with 1 kazayis. But ideally, it's the same numbers as the mitzi matzah. That hand, we say a half of a hand matzah, mishas al-chak, 1/4. Moshe Tzedek says, by a thin hand matzahs, ideally it would be a half a matzah. Or a Bonner in his sefer says, by thin matzahs, it would be 40% of a matzah. By machine matzah, ideally again, it would be a half a matzah. By machine, according to Rabbi Heinemann's cheshbainis, if someone's ill, 1/4 of a machine matzah would be enough. In the Moshe Tzedek, it says one needs 2/3 of a matzah. Again, a kol kafi minig of exactly the shear and the size that one would eat. Of course, there are other eitzes besides volume. One could use a diagram. One has a diagram they're printed that shows exactly the size. You put up the matzah, the maror against that size, then one would be able to make that calculation as well. Let's talk about maror. There are several types of maror. We're going to talk about romaine lettuce or the ground up horseradish. Let's first talk about the ground up horseradish. This is a plastic schnapps cup. The plastic schnapps cup is 1 fluid ounce. It even says on the bottom, 1 ounce. It's approximately 30 milliliters filled to the top. As we said, most shiurim of a kazayis hold that a kazayis is approximately 1 fluid ounce. If you want to be machmir, you go a bit higher, as we said, to 33 cubic centimeters or 38 cubic centimeters. This is 30. If you want to be make a little bit, some go down to even 27 cubic centimeters. This is a kazayis maror. It fits into a cup. It's 1 fluid ounce, about 30 cubic centimeters. Those who go a little less would take a little bit out. Those who want to be more machmir would add a little bit and get a little bit of higher number. But this is a kazayis of maror. Okay, romaine lettuce is one of the ways of of Maror, and these are smaller stalks, very smaller stalks. Rav Dovid Feinstein in his Haggadah says you want 8 by 10 inches of the romaine lettuce. Of course, but here we have really 2.5 very small stalks that are spread out, and this certainly would be probably a little bit more than a kazayas of Maror. Again, sometimes you can have a very large stalk, which in itself is a kazayas. Again, this would be just slightly more than a kazayas. Now, if you're just using stalks itself, then it would be even a little bit less based on the stalks, the actual stalks. And here we have just the stalks with only a little bit of leaf left on it. And this would also, these stalks of Maror would be equal to a kazayas. This would certainly be. If you want to mix and match, you could certainly have some of this and put the chrein inside. And then add the chrein. You could have a half a kazayas of the lettuce and a half a kazayas of the chrein and mix it in. Of course, the Maror is dipped in the haraises, which is not included in the kazayas. By koirech, as we mentioned, you have the Matza as we described above, and the Maror would also be equal to a fluid ounce, the same amount. Rav Dovid Feinstein, in his Haggadah, in the Kol Daidi, says that even 7/10 of a fluid ounce of chrein would be enough for koirech. But Maror itself needs a full fluid ounce, but by koirech, 7/10 of fluid ounce would be enough. Now, at the beginning of the Seder, we eat karpas. As is known, by karpas, we make a bar priya adama, and we eat bedavka less than a kazayas, because otherwise, and we have in mind the Maror, and we eat less than a kazayas, because otherwise, we would get into a bracha achrayna issue. Okay, here's a potato. Our minhag is to eat a potato for karpas. It's not a perfect cube, but we can get a rough estimate here of what the volume is. Is it less than a kazayas or not? So it's approximately 3.5 centimeters by about 2.5 centimeters by 2.5. It's about 3.5 by 2.5 by 2.5, which is about 22 cubic centimeters, which is less than a kazayas. So by karpas, if you took a potato this size, it would certainly be less than a kazayas, and that would be good. You don't want a big potato. This potato certainly is less than a kazayas. You dip it in salt water and you eat it, and you have no issue of bracha achrayna. Let's talk about daled kaisis. Daled kaisis, one has to drink a revius. What is a revius? Revius means a quarter of a lug. The generally lowest numbers for revius are 2.9 fluid ounces or 86 milliliters. The gematria of kais. This is the shita of Rav Chaim Noah. The higher numbers are Chazon Ish, 5.1 fluid ounces, 150 milliliters. The gematria kais hagun. Some go in the middle. Rav Dovid Feinstein is Haggadah, goes with 4.42 fluid ounces. Rabbi Heinemann, Shlita, we published 3.8 fluid ounces. Let's see how much this is. Again, the becher has to be a revius. We'll see in a moment exactly how much you have to drink. This becher is the Shiurei of Rav Chaim Noah, and we could measure this out. We take the graduated cylinder, and we see that it's approximately 90 milliliters, which is 86 Rav Chaim Noah. This is approximately 3 fluid ounces, and the shear of Rav Chaim Noah. This becher. This becher is a little bit more than the Chazon Ish's shear. We fill up our graduated cylinder, and we see how much it holds. Here's the becher, and we see how much it holds, and it holds about a little more than 162 milliliters. Chazon Ish was 150 milliliters, so it would be till here. It's a little bit bigger than the shear of the Chazon Ish. And again, the sheet is in between. This would be a smaller becher, and this would be a larger becher. So how much do you need to drink? Ideally, one drinks the entire kais, no matter how big the kais is. That's why Pesach night, it's not a good idea to have a huge becher, because it's muhuradik to drink the whole becher. So if you have a 7-ounce becher, it's very hard to drink 7 ounces of wine 4 times. So ideally, you want to get the shear that you hold and get a becher of that size. L'maisa, it's enough to drink Rav Kais, which is also Rav Revius. But it's difficult to have a kais that holds exactly a revius, so then you drink Rav kais. So at the very least, you want to drink the Rav kais, or at the very minimum, the Rav revius, which on average is a Malay Lugma, is one's cheekful. So again, the Rav revius, if we're saying a revius is, let's say we're going with the 4 ounce, 3.8 ounce measurement, then you want to at least drink the Rav revius, which is about 2 fluid ounces, in order to be yaitze dalet kaises. And the same is true for kiddush. That's how much one needs to drink for kiddush. How fast does one have to drink? So it's shir kadei shir shtias revius. You want to drink the revius in the amount of time that it takes to drink a revius. How long is that? So Rav Heinemann Shlita goes with 30 seconds. That's you took a drink and you stopped, and then you finish drinking. A person drinks in 2 breaks, so 30 seconds would be enough. You want to drink. You want to drink the shear in within a span of 30 seconds. But now, if someone can only drink a Malay Lugmav, then in that case, one would not recite a bracha achreina at the end. If your last kais, you only drank a Malay Lugmav, they get someone who drank a revius to be mitzu in a bracha achreina. Because again, the halacha is if you only drank a Malay Lugmav, then one does not recite a bracha achreina. So again, we're saying on average, we have let's say 4 ounces is on average. Again, we have a little more than 5, a little less than 3 ounces. In the middle is 4. A Malay Lugmav, a Rav revius, we're saying is 2 fluid ounces. And therefore the minimum amount, no matter what, the person cannot drink a lot, they should drink by each kais 2 fluid ounces. Which means if someone has a difficult time, that's all they should drink. Ultimately, they'll be drinking 2 fluid ounces 4 times. If that's difficult, one is allowed to dilute the wine. Let's illustrate that. Wine needs to be at least 4% alcohol. So let's say you have a wine which is 9% alcohol. You would put in, let's say, 50% water, 50% wine. You'd get a little more, 4.5% alcohol. That would be fine. In fact, you could even put a touch more water in. But basically, let's say 9%, you're going to go with 50-50 approximately, and you'll have certainly enough alcohol to be considered as wine. If you have grape juice, if the grape juice is already light, then you don't want to tamper with it. You want to drink it straight. If you have regular grape juice, like we've poured here, just for our example, then you're able to cut it in half, which means you would have half grape juice and half water. So we're going to give an example of diluting. We use grape juice, but let's pretend also this would be the same thing if you have wine, which is 8 or 9%. And that is you're going to dilute it. One way of diluting would be to fill a cup halfway with water and halfway with wine. But if you want to measure it, this graduated cylinder holds 250 milliliters. So let's say you want to dilute, again, this is grape juice, so you could dilute it 50-50. So we could fill this up to the 250 mark. This is about slightly more than 125. Or let's say this is wine. It would be this, let's say wine that's 9% or 8% alcohol. We would also fill it up with water. So again, we're giving an example of wine and grape juice the same way. If this was wine, which was 14% alcohol, you could have less wine and more water. So what would you do? You'd fill this up with water and measure this off before Yontif. Ideally before Yontif. You're allowed to do measurements on Yontif for L'dvar Mitzvah. So if you forgot to do it before Yontif, you can do it on Yontif. We have a 250 milliliter combination or mixture of grape juice and water. And again, if it was 9% wine, we could say this is how you would do to get wine, which is good for the Seder. Now, you fill your becher by each, you mark this off, you can put this in a container, and now comes the Seder, and now you fill your kais. Let's say you're going to use the smaller becher, for example, because it's hard for you to drink wine. Let's say you're going to get a 4-ounce becher, let's say. Okay, this is a little less than, there's less than that, but you're going to fill up the kais, and now this would be a shear of a watered-down wine or grape juice, and you would have a dal kaisa. I didn't fill it all the way, but you would fill it all the way, and that would be your dal kaisa. So it comes out, if you dilute the wine or the grape juice, let's say you dilute grape juice, if you have a hard time at the Seder, what you could do is you could dilute it 50-50. So let's think about it. If you have a 4-ounce kais, and you have diluted grape juice, that's really, in that 4-ounce kais, you have 2 ounces of grape juice. And you only have to drink rive of it. You only have to drink 2 ounces. That's your Malay Lugma. That's your cheekful. And therefore, one would only have to drink 2 ounces. Of those 2 ounces, one of those ounces is water, one of those ounces is grape juice. So by the end of the Seder, you will have only drank 4 fluid ounces of grape juice. Again, because you had a mixture. Each kais held 4 ounces. Only 2 of them was grape juice. You only drank half of that, so you only drank 1 ounce of grape juice. You do it 4 times, and by the end of the Seder, you've only drank 4 fluid ounces of grape juice, much less, and much, for people who have health issues and cannot drink a lot, that would be a good eitzah. If you want to drink wine, which is the more mohudic way at the Seder, you have alcohol, which is 9%. Again, you 50-50, and now you're only drinking half wine, you drink half the kais, rive kais, and by the end of the night, you've drank much less wine than too much to handle, and therefore one would be able to have the Seder properly without drinking too much wine. On the topic of shiurim, we mentioned the Malay Lugma. How big is a Malay Lugma? So we said it's a Rav Revius on average. An average adult male is a Rav Revius. If we're saying a Revius is about 4 ounces, let's say, so a Rav Revius would be roughly about 2 fluid ounces. So how do you calculate a Malay Lugma? It could also be relevant for Yom Kippur, because at Yom Kippur, Pachas Mikashir, someone who's ill, Chas v'Shalom, Pachas Mikashir is less than that personal Malay Lugma. Oig Melech HaBashan had a big Malay Lugma. He had a big cheek. A little bar mitzvah bacher is going to have a smaller cheekful. How to calculate that? You fill your mouth as much as possible with water, and you spit it out, and then you put it in a graduated cylinder. I tried it, and I came up with about 104 milliliters. That is 2 Malay Lugmas. That's my full mouth. Half of that would be 52 milliliters. That's the cutoff shear. That's a Malay Lugma. So let's say in Yom Kippur, someone that had 52 milliliters, the Pachas Mikashir, Pachas Malay Lugma would be less than 52 milliliters. So let's say 50 milliliters. A person of that size would drink 50 milliliters would be allowed to drink 50 milliliters every 7 minutes. If that's not enough, they could drink even more frequently. One would consult with his or her Rav. But this is just a sample of what a Malay Lugma is. Of course, the shear for eating is a Kesefes Hagasa. That's the standard size, no matter how big a person is. And again, if Chas Shalom is to get somebody who's ill, or maybe for good reasons, who gives birth and is allowed to, right before Yom Kippur, and is allowed to eat and drink on Yom Kippur, then she would have that shaila as well. So we've seen the shiurim, how big a kazayas is, how big a revius is, a kabeya, the different opinions. We've also seen what kedei achilas prasis, kedei shir shtiyas revius, how long it is. It's very interesting that in this world, in the HaLMaaseh, where we have space and time. Volume, everything takes up space. Any matter takes up space. And also time. Time marches on. And everything we do, there's space and time. In the Beis HaMikdash, we know that they were above, they were l'malam min hateva. There was no space. The Aron, as we know the calculations that we read recently in the Torah, it didn't measure, it didn't add up, because al pi nes, it was a nes. L'malam min hateva, there is no space. The Aron didn't take up space. And we know also, l'malam min hateva, there's no concept of time. The Baruch Shalom has the ability to stop time. But in HaLMaaseh, in the world that we're in, we have space and we have time. We're governed by space and by time. It's interesting that comes Pesach, we have such a focus on space and time, volume and time. We're makadesh, these inyanim. We go through life dealing with space and time. Comes Pesach, and we talk about space, how much, how big, how much I need to eat. By making it into a Torah discussion, by making divrei Torah out of space, how big, how much, and by making time, by giving kedusha to the zman, kedusha zman. I have this amount of time by learning it, understanding. Is it 3 minutes? Is it 2 minutes? Kedei achilas pras, chatzi surah, this much, that much. We actually take the space and time, the HaLMaaseh, and we're makadesh it. That's what Yontif is all about. That's what Shabbos is all about. The ability to take matter, to take time, to take HaLMaaseh, to take Gashmias, and to be able to be makadesh it. This year, especially, we have a Shabbos going into Yontif. We combine back to back the Shabbos into the Yontif, where we have Shiurim on Shabbos and Shiurim on Yontif of Pesach, Bez Hashem, and that's chus of us sanctifying, being mekadesh, these inyanim of space and time. We should be zoicha, Mitzvah Hashem, to have the Karban Pesach to next year, Mitzvah Hashem, to speak about how much of the Korban Pesach one has to eat, how fast I have to eat it, what time I have to eat it, with who I have to eat it, as we learned in Daf Yomi through the past few months in Masechet Pesachim. Mitzvah Hashem will be Zoiche, Pesach Hashem, with the coming of Sheikh Zechenu B'Meher Yameinu. Amen.